Sometimes the smallest sounds in an old house are not warnings of danger, but invitations to remember what time tried to hide. Snow drifted steadily beyond the cabin windows as Daniel Carter settled deeper into the worn leather chair beside the fireplace, allowing the familiar crackle of burning logs to soften the silence that had long become his closest companion. The Colorado winter had arrived early that year, coating the surrounding pines in thick blankets of white and transforming the mountains beyond his property into quiet giants watching over the valley below. Inside the cabin, warmth wrapped itself around old wooden beams and weathered floorboards polished by decades of footsteps belonging to people Daniel had never known. He pulled the faded wool blanket higher across his lap and lifted a chipped ceramic mug toward his lips, breathing in the scent of black coffee while Shadow rested near the hearth. The 6-year-old German Shepherd had spent the evening exactly as he always did, stretched comfortably before the fire with pale cream and slate gray fur illuminated by dancing orange light. Daniel had purchased the cabin nearly 5 years earlier after leaving military life behind, seeking distance from crowded streets, unanswered questions, and memories that seemed louder in cities than they did beneath open skies. The cabin had suited him perfectly. It asked for little beyond maintenance and patience. Its imperfections had become familiar companions. The creak near the staircase, the whistle of winter wind through aging window frames, the occasional groan of settling timber after snowfall. Shadow suddenly lifted his head. Daniel noticed the movement immediately. The German Shepherd's ears stood upright, amber eyes fixed upon the fireplace with unwavering concentration. He did not bark. He did not growl. The change was subtle enough that someone unfamiliar with him might have missed it entirely. Daniel lowered his coffee mug. "What is it, Shadow?" he asked softly. The dog remained motionless. Flames continued their steady dance across blackened logs while sparks drifted upward through the chimney. Outside, snow tapped gently against the glass. Inside, the silence shifted almost imperceptibly. Daniel studied Shadow carefully. Throughout the years they had spent together, the German Shepherd had proven himself remarkably steady. Thunderstorms never unsettled him. Wildlife wandering near the property rarely earned more than a passing glance. Whatever held his attention now was different. Shadow rose slowly to his feet and stepped closer to the fireplace, muscles tense beneath his thick winter coat. His gaze remained fixed near the lower corner of the stone hearth where soot stained the aging brickwork. Daniel set his mug aside and leaned forward. "Shadow," he repeated, quieter this time. The German Shepherd tilted his head slightly, listening to something Daniel could not hear. Then came a sound so faint Daniel initially wondered if the crackling fire had played tricks on his imagination. A soft scraping echoed from within the fireplace itself. Wood shifted. Ash settled. Something tapped lightly against stone. Shadow took another step forward but stopped at the edge of the hearth, eyes never wavering. Daniel pushed himself out of the chair and moved cautiously across the room. The warmth of the fire brushed against his face as he knelt beside the dog. Together they stared into the glowing shadows between the old bricks. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then, from a narrow gap near the back corner of the fireplace concealed beneath decades of soot and neglect, a small glass object emerged into the firelight and rolled slowly across the hearthstone until it came to rest near Shadow's outstretched paw. The German Shepherd lowered his head toward it, but did not touch it. Daniel reached forward carefully, his pulse quickening as flames reflected against the smooth surface of what appeared to be an old marble no larger than the tip of his thumb. Encased within the cloudy glass, barely visible beneath years of dust and ash, were 2 faded initials that seemed to glow beneath the firelight, as though waiting patiently for someone to finally notice they had been there all along. Daniel Carter turned the marble over carefully in the palm of his hand, while the fire continued to burn behind the soot-darkened bricks, casting restless shadows across the cabin walls. Up close, the tiny object appeared older than he had first realized. Its once clear glass had clouded with age, and faint scratches marked its smooth surface as though countless small hands had carried it through another lifetime. He rubbed away a layer of ash with the sleeve of his faded plaid shirt and brought it closer to the firelight. The initials hidden inside became easier to distinguish. H.C. 2 simple letters suspended forever within the center of the marble. Shadow remained beside the hearth, standing perfectly still. The German shepherd's amber eyes never left the lower corner of the fireplace. Daniel glanced toward him before looking back at the marble. "You knew something was there," he murmured softly. Shadow flicked one ear in response, but refused to relax. Outside, snow continued falling steadily against the cabin windows, blanketing the Colorado landscape in silence. Inside, however, the atmosphere had shifted. The room no longer felt entirely familiar. Daniel rose slowly from the hearth and carried the marble toward the kitchen table beneath the hanging light fixture. He opened the small drawer where he kept reading glasses and a flashlight before returning to kneel near the fireplace once again. The beam of light swept across blackened stones and aging mortar that had likely remained untouched for decades. He had repaired sections of the cabin roof after purchasing the property. He had replaced damaged floorboards near the back hallway and reinforced the porch railing before winter storms arrived each year. Yet he had never once examined the fireplace beyond its usefulness as a source of warmth. Shadow lowered his head toward the same corner he had been watching since the evening began. His nose hovered inches above the hearthstone. Then, with remarkable restraint, he lifted one paw and touched the edge of a particular brick. Daniel stared at it. At first glance, it appeared no different from the others surrounding it. But under the flashlight's narrow beam, subtle differences emerged. The mortar framing its edges looked thinner, cleaner, less settled. He pressed his fingers against the cool surface. The brick shifted slightly beneath the pressure. Daniel immediately pulled his hand back and exhaled slowly. "That cannot be a coincidence," he whispered. He hesitated for several seconds before reaching forward again. Years of military training had taught him patience. Observe first. React second. The cabin had been standing long before he arrived. Generations of ordinary lives had unfolded beneath its roof. Birthday celebrations, winter mornings, family dinners beside the very fire now warming his hands. Somewhere along the way, someone had intentionally concealed something within these walls. Shadow stepped closer until his shoulder brushed lightly against Daniel's arm. The German shepherd remained calm but insistent, his steady presence encouraging rather than alarming. Daniel tightened his grip around the flashlight and carefully pressed against the loose brick once more. It moved farther this time. A faint scraping echoed from somewhere behind the stone. Dust drifted into the firelight. Daniel felt his pulse quicken as cold air brushed unexpectedly across his fingertips from the narrow opening hidden beyond the hearth. The marble suddenly felt heavier in his pocket. H.C. The initials lingered in his thoughts while snow continued to fall beyond the cabin windows. Shadow stood beside him without fear, his amber gaze fixed upon the darkness behind the shifting brick as though he had been waiting patiently all evening for Daniel to discover that the small glass marble rolling from the fire had never been the real secret hidden inside the old cabin walls. Daniel Carter sat back on his heels as fine dust drifted from the loosened brick and disappeared into the warm glow cast by the fire behind him. The cabin had fallen silent again except for the steady crackle of burning logs and the distant whisper of snow brushing against the roof overhead. For several moments, he simply stared at the narrow opening revealed beyond the old masonry, his flashlight illuminating a hidden space that had remained untouched for longer than he had owned the property. Shadow stood close enough that Daniel could feel the steady rhythm of the German shepherd's breathing. There was no fear in the dog's posture, no signs of distress, only the same patient certainty that had guided his attention to the fireplace in the first place. Daniel reached forward carefully and worked the brick free from its place in the hearth. The weight surprised him. He lowered it gently onto the hearthstone before directing the flashlight deeper into the concealed compartment. The beam caught layers of dust coating rough wooden supports hidden behind the stonework. Cobwebs shimmered briefly before dissolving into shadow. Then something metallic reflected the light. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Tucked against the back of the narrow cavity sat a small rectangular tin box no larger than an old recipe container. Time had dulled its once polished surface, leaving patches of tarnish and rust along the edges. Even so, someone had placed it there deliberately. His pulse quickened beneath the quiet discipline years of military service had taught him to maintain. Shadow lowered himself beside the hearth but remained alert, amber eyes shifting between Daniel and the hidden compartment as if urging patience rather than haste. Daniel hesitated before reaching into the opening. The cold air inside contrasted sharply against the warmth radiating from the fire. His fingertips brushed the metal surface before carefully pulling the tin container into the light. Dust settled across his jeans as he sat cross-legged on the braided rug near the hearth. Snow continued to drift beyond the darkened windows while the cabin wrapped itself around him in familiar creaks and sighs. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. The box rested heavily across his palms despite its modest size. The lid bore faint scratches that hinted at years of handling before it had disappeared behind brick and mortar. Daniel studied it without opening it immediately. He thought about the marble resting in his pocket with the initials H.C. suspended beneath cloudy glass. He thought about the unknown hands that had hidden this container inside the walls of a family home. A child's marble. A concealed compartment. A box preserved in darkness. The pieces belonged together somehow. Shadow shifted closer until his shoulder pressed gently against Daniel's arm. The simple gesture steadied him. "You have good instincts," Daniel said quietly, running one hand along the German shepherd's neck. Shadow blinked slowly before resting his head beside Daniel's knee. Finally, Daniel lifted the lid. The hinges protested with a soft metallic groan. Inside, carefully protected beneath yellowed tissue paper, rested a stack of black and white photographs tied with faded blue ribbon. Beneath them lay several folded envelopes secured by twine and a silver key attached to a tarnished brass tag. The firelight flickered across the photographs as Daniel picked up the top image. A smiling family stared back at him from another era, standing proudly in front of the very cabin he now called home. Snow had begun falling around them even then. A man and woman stood shoulder to shoulder, while two children bundled in winter coats smiled toward the camera. Daniel's breath caught as he turned the photograph over and discovered neat handwriting preserved against the passing decades. Across the back, written in careful blue ink, were four simple words that transformed curiosity into something far deeper. For Hannah Cooper, when found. Daniel Carter sat motionless beside the fireplace as the photograph rested carefully between his fingers, the firelight illuminating faces frozen in a moment that had once been ordinary to the people captured within its frame. Snow continued drifting across the cabin windows, softening the world beyond the glass, while the old house seemed to hold its breath around him. Shadow remained stretched beside his knee, his amber eyes following every movement without urgency, as though the German shepherd understood that some discoveries deserved silence before explanation. Daniel turned the photograph over once more and traced the faded blue handwriting with his thumb. For Hannah Cooper, when found. The words settled heavily in his thoughts. They did not sound like instructions attached to forgotten valuables. They sounded like hope preserved against impossible odds. He carefully lifted the remaining photographs from the tin box. Each image revealed fragments of another family's life unfolding within the same walls he now called home. A little girl missing her front teeth while holding up a snowman scarf. A woman kneeling beside a summer garden overflowing with tomatoes and wildflowers. A man teaching a child how to cast a fishing line into a mountain stream beneath bright Colorado skies. Birthdays, holidays, Sunday afternoons. The ordinary moments people rarely realize will someday become priceless. Daniel swallowed against the unexpected tightness in his throat. He had spent years believing that survival depended upon keeping memories carefully contained. Yet here, inside a hidden compartment built behind an old fireplace, another family had done the exact opposite. They had preserved their love openly, trusting that one day someone might carry it forward. Shadow lifted his head as Daniel untied the bundle of yellowed envelopes resting beneath the photographs. The paper crackled softly as he examined the names written across their surfaces. Every envelope bore the same handwriting. Every one carried the same destination. Hannah Cooper. Daniel hesitated before opening the first letter. Years of military service had taught him respect for boundaries and the quiet dignity people deserved, even long after they were gone. Yet the message written on the back of the photograph lingered in his thoughts. When found, whoever had hidden these things had intended them to be discovered eventually. The first envelope contained a folded newspaper clipping dated more than 3 decades earlier. Daniel unfolded it beneath the kitchen light and scanned the brief article. The Cooper family had once been well known throughout the small mountain community. Local residents described them as generous, hardworking, and deeply involved in town events. Then, almost without warning, they had disappeared from public life. There was no scandal attached to their absence. No dramatic explanation. The article merely noted that family circumstances had led them to relocate unexpectedly. Daniel frowned. The explanation felt incomplete. Too careful. He returned the clipping to its envelope before reaching for another letter. Before opening it, he noticed something tucked beneath the stack of papers at the bottom of the tin box. It was a folded property tax receipt bearing the cabin address from 34 years earlier. Along the edge of the document, written hastily in blue ink, was a single sentence that caused Daniel's pulse to quicken beneath the steady crackle of the fire. If Hannah ever comes home, tell her we never stopped looking. Shadow slowly rose to his feet and moved toward the dark cabin window, gazing out into the falling snow as though listening to echoes carried across time. Daniel stared at the handwritten words resting in his lap while the warmth of the fireplace brushed against his face. Somewhere beyond the mystery of hidden compartments and forgotten photographs existed a little girl named Hannah Cooper, a family that had waited for her, and a story the mountains themselves had somehow guarded all these years. The fire had burned lower by the time Daniel Carter unfolded the first letter addressed to Hannah Cooper, and outside the cabin windows the Colorado snowfall continued beneath a sky that had disappeared into the darkness of winter night. Shadow returned from the window and settled beside the leather chair, resting his head across his front paws while watching Daniel with quiet attentiveness. The old envelope felt fragile beneath Daniel's fingertips. Its edges had softened with age, and the scent of cedar and dust rose from the yellowed paper as though the years themselves had been folded carefully inside. He unfolded the letter slowly, mindful of the delicate creases. The handwriting was elegant and deliberate. Dear Hannah, if you are reading this, then life has found a way to bring you home, even if only through these pages. Daniel paused. There was no urgency in the words. No panic. Only tenderness. He continued reading beneath the glow of the lamp while the fireplace crackled softly nearby. The writer introduced himself as Thomas Cooper, Hannah's grandfather. He spoke of teaching her to skip stones across the creek behind the cabin and how she had once insisted every pine cone in the forest deserved a name. He remembered the way she laughed whenever snowflakes landed on Shadow's predecessor, an old family dog named Murphy. He described Sunday breakfasts filled with pancakes and maple syrup, evenings spent reading stories beside the same fireplace now warming Daniel's hands, and the small marble Hannah carried everywhere because she believed its swirling colors looked like captured galaxies. Daniel instinctively touched the marble resting in his pocket. H.C. Hannah Cooper. The initials no longer belonged to an unknown mystery. They belonged to a little girl deeply loved by the people who filled these letters with memory. The second letter carried a different tone. Thomas wrote of difficult seasons and decisions made too quickly beneath the weight of circumstances he did not explain fully. He admitted that families sometimes become separated not because love disappears, but because life unfolds in ways no one expects. Yet through every paragraph, one truth remained constant. They never stopped hoping to find her again. Daniel glanced toward Shadow. The German shepherd blinked slowly beneath the firelight before resting his chin upon Daniel's boot. For years, Daniel had believed resilience meant enduring loss without revisiting it. Keep moving. Keep surviving. Do not linger where grief lives. Yet these letters challenged that philosophy. Thomas Cooper had preserved every memory not because he feared pain, but because love deserved witnesses. Daniel unfolded another page tucked beneath the stack. This one contained no stories. Instead, it listed names, dates, and an address for the First Mountain Savings Bank in the nearby town of Silver Ridge. Attached to the bottom corner by faded tape was a tarnished brass tag bearing a number that matched the silver key hidden within the tin box. Daniel studied the key lying across the kitchen table. Until now, part of him had wondered if the hidden compartment concealed something practical. Forgotten savings, valuable heirlooms, some long-lost fortune hidden behind the fireplace bricks. But nothing within these letters suggested greed. Everything pointed toward devotion. The final paragraph of Thomas's note was written with slightly shakier handwriting than the rest. If we cannot place this in your hands ourselves, perhaps someone kind enough to find it will finish what we could not. Outside, snow settled quietly across the mountain landscape while the cabin glowed against the darkness. Daniel looked toward the silver key resting beside the marble and the stack of letters preserved through decades of silence. Shadow slowly lifted his head, ears turning toward the front door as though listening to something beyond the storm. Daniel followed the dog's gaze before returning his attention to the key. Tomorrow, if the roads allowed it, they would drive to Silver Ridge and discover whether the last gift Thomas Cooper had prepared for Hannah remained waiting exactly where Hope had left it. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of brushed steel as Daniel Carter stood on the cabin porch watching pale sunlight spill across the snow-covered Colorado Valley. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world softened by fresh powder and silence, so complete it seemed to absorb every lingering thought. Shadow waited beside the truck, his pale cream and slate gray coat bright against the untouched white landscape. The German shepherd watched Daniel secure the tin box, the letters, the photographs, the marble marked with Hannah Cooper's initials, and the silver key inside a canvas satchel resting carefully on the passenger seat. The drive to Silver Ridge took nearly an hour along mountain roads lined with frost-covered pines and frozen streams glistening beneath the morning light. Daniel had traveled these roads countless times for supplies and routine errands, yet everything appeared different now. The mountains themselves seemed less distant. Every curve in the road carried the quiet anticipation of unfinished stories finally reaching their next chapter. Shadow sat upright beside him, amber eyes shifting between the passing scenery and the road ahead with patient vigilance. Silver Ridge emerged gradually from the valley floor, its modest main street framed by brick storefronts and old-fashioned lampposts dusted with snow. The town carried the familiar warmth of mountain communities where strangers rarely remained strangers for long. Daniel parked near First Mountain Savings Bank, a two-story brick building that had stood on the corner for generations. The brass lettering above the entrance reflected the winter sunlight. He glanced down at the silver key resting in his palm before exhaling slowly. Shadow stepped from the truck and walked beside him across the sidewalk, drawing smiles from several townspeople beginning their day. Inside, warmth greeted them alongside the scent of polished wood and fresh coffee drifting from a staff break room. The lobby remained modest and inviting. Framed photographs documenting the town's history lined the walls while holiday decorations lingered despite the season's passing. A woman with silver hair behind the reception desk looked up from her computer and offered a welcoming smile. "How can I help you today?" she asked kindly. Daniel explained carefully, placing the tarnished brass tag and silver key upon the counter. He shared only the essentials: the hidden compartment, the letters, the instructions left behind decades earlier. The receptionist's expression shifted from polite professionalism to quiet curiosity before she excused herself briefly. Moments later, an older bank manager emerged from a nearby office. His name tag read Walter Benson. He adjusted his glasses and examined the key with visible surprise. "I have not seen one of these in years," he admitted softly. Most of the older safety deposit records were archived long ago. He disappeared into a back office while Daniel waited beneath the gentle hum of fluorescent lights. Shadow remained seated at his side, calm and composed despite the uncertainty hanging in the air. Minutes stretched longer than expected before Walter returned carrying a worn ledger book. He turned several brittle pages before stopping abruptly. "Well?" he murmured, studying the faded handwriting before lifting his gaze toward Daniel. "It appears this key still corresponds to an active safety deposit box." Daniel's pulse quickened despite himself. Years of discipline encouraged measured expectations. Yet another part of him could not ignore the possibility unfolding before him. Families had hidden fortunes in places like these. Property deeds, bonds, jewelry. The practical side of his mind quietly calculated what decades of accumulated value might mean. Shadow nudged Daniel's hand with his nose before settling once more at his feet. The gesture grounded him instantly. Walter offered a gentle smile before retrieving another set of keys from a secured cabinet. "If you will follow me," he said. Together they moved toward the vault hidden beyond the public lobby, carrying with them the hopes of a grandfather, the faith preserved in forgotten letters, and the growing realization that whatever waited behind the steel door had remained untouched for more than 30 years. Daniel Carter followed Walter Benson through the heavy steel door and into the quiet vault beneath First Mountain Savings Bank, the muted hum of fluorescent lights replacing the familiar sounds of wind and crackling fire that had filled his cabin only hours earlier. The room carried the scent of polished metal and aged paper, a place built to preserve what people feared losing most. Rows of safety deposit boxes stretched across the walls in orderly symmetry, each one holding fragments of lives condensed into documents, jewelry, photographs, and promises meant to outlast time itself. Shadow padded beside Daniel with measured steps, his nails clicking softly against the tiled floor before he settled near the entrance to the private viewing area. The German shepherd remained calm, his amber eyes following Daniel with quiet reassurance. Walter consulted the brass tag once more before stopping before a lower row of boxes. He inserted the bank key into the lock and nodded toward Daniel. "The second key is yours," he said gently. Daniel withdrew the tarnished silver key from his pocket and hesitated for a brief moment before sliding it into place. The mechanism resisted at first before yielding with a soft metallic click that echoed through the otherwise silent room. Together, the two keys completed a task that had remained unfinished for more than 30 years. Walter carefully removed the narrow metal box and placed it upon the viewing table before excusing himself to provide privacy. Daniel stood motionless as the vault door closed behind him. He stared at the container resting before him. Somewhere deep within, the practical part of his mind still entertained possibilities born from countless stories told around small-town diners and old veterans' halls. Hidden savings bonds, rare coins, jewelry passed through generations. The sort of inheritance capable of changing lives overnight. Shadow rose slowly and approached the table, pressing his shoulder lightly against Daniel's leg before sitting beside him. The simple gesture steadied him once more. Daniel lifted the lid. His breath caught almost immediately, though not for the reasons he had expected. There were no stacks of cash, no velvet boxes cradling precious stones, no certificates promising wealth beyond imagination. Instead, neatly arranged within the safety deposit box were several leather-bound journals tied together with ribbon, a bundle of photographs protected inside clear sleeves, greeting cards decorated with childish handwriting, and a sealed envelope bearing a familiar inscription written in careful blue ink. For Hannah Cooper. Daniel stared down at the contents, confusion mingling with disappointment he had not realized he carried. After the hidden compartment behind the fireplace, the mysterious letters, the silver key, and the decades of unanswered questions, some part of him had unconsciously prepared for a dramatic revelation. Something tangible enough to justify the years these objects had remained untouched. Yet before him rested memories rather than riches, stories rather than securities. He lifted the top journal and opened it carefully. The first page bore Thomas Cooper's handwriting. "If these journals reach you, then they carry everything money never could." Daniel lowered himself into the chair and turned another page. Thomas had documented ordinary moments with extraordinary devotion. The first snowfall Hannah had tried to catch on her tongue. The way she insisted every birthday candle deserved a separate wish. The afternoons she spent drawing constellations on scrap paper because she believed every family had its own stars watching overhead. There were recipes tucked between pages, pressed wildflowers, ticket stubs from county fairs, and notes describing conversations too precious to trust solely to memory. Daniel felt the initial flicker of disappointment dissolve beneath an unexpected wave of understanding. Across the room, Shadow rested quietly at his feet, while sunlight filtered faintly through the narrow basement windows. The greatest treasures hidden within the vault had never been intended to increase someone's bank account. They had been preserved to answer a far more human fear. The fear that one day love itself might be forgotten if nobody remained to remember the details. Daniel turned another page as Thomas's steady handwriting continued across the paper, and with every line he began to realize that the inheritance waiting all these years inside the old bank vault had never been about what Hannah Cooper might receive, but about ensuring she would always know exactly how deeply she had been loved. Daniel Carter remained seated in the private viewing room long after he had expected to leave, turning page after page of Thomas Cooper's journals while Shadow rested quietly beside his chair. Outside the small basement windows of First Mountain Savings Bank, the winter afternoon gradually softened beneath pale sunlight reflecting across the snow-covered streets of Silver Ridge. Inside the journals, however, entire decades breathed with unexpected warmth. Thomas had recorded ordinary details with remarkable devotion. He described Hannah's habit of collecting smooth stones from creek beds because she believed every rock carried a hidden story. He wrote about the afternoons she insisted on helping bake apple pies despite covering the kitchen counters with more flour than dough. There were entries celebrating school achievements and handwritten observations about the way Hannah always paused to wave goodbye to the mountains before family road trips. Daniel turned another page and discovered pressed wildflowers tucked carefully between journal entries. A faded crayon drawing slipped into his lap, depicting a small cabin surrounded by pine trees beneath an oversized sun. 3 smiling figures stood beside a dog whose ears appeared impossibly large for its body. Across the bottom, written in uneven childhood handwriting, were the words, "Home is where everyone waits for you." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. The disappointment he had initially felt upon discovering no hidden fortune had transformed into something he struggled to name. During his years in uniform, he had witnessed people cling desperately to objects while losing sight of what truly sustained them. Promotions faded. Possessions disappeared. Yet memories rooted in love somehow endured long after everything else changed. Shadow lifted his head as Daniel carefully unfolded the sealed envelope Thomas had addressed specifically to whoever eventually found these belongings. The handwriting had become shakier than in the earlier letters, but the message remained steady. "Thank you for staying long enough to listen. If Hannah never returned, I prayed that someone kind would understand these things still mattered. Please tell her that absence never changed how deeply she was loved." Daniel swallowed hard before reading the final lines. "There is one more thing you should know. Hannah did not vanish. We lost contact after her parents moved away during difficult years. Pride and time built distances none of us knew how to cross. If she is still somewhere beneath these same stars, perhaps this story can still find its way home." Daniel lowered the letter into his lap while silence settled gently around the room. For the first time since discovering the marble beside the fireplace, the mystery shifted from questions about the past to possibilities waiting in the present. Hannah Cooper might still be alive. She would no longer be the little girl smiling in black and white photographs. She would be a woman carrying decades of her own joys, losses, and unanswered questions. The thought unsettled and inspired him simultaneously. Walter Benson returned quietly to check on them and found Daniel surrounded by journals, photographs, and greeting cards. After hearing a brief explanation, the older man adjusted his glasses thoughtfully. "Silver Ridge remembers many things," he said softly. "Sometimes all it takes is asking the right people." Shadow rose immediately, tail brushing gently against the chair as though recognizing the importance of what came next. Daniel gathered the journals carefully into the canvas satchel, handling each item with the reverence they deserved. Through the bank windows, the mountains stood unchanged against the winter sky, patient witnesses to the passing of generations. As Daniel clipped Shadow's leash into place and prepared to step back into the snowy afternoon, he realized the inheritance hidden behind an old fireplace had become something far greater than preserved memories. It had become an invitation to complete a promise left unfinished by time itself, and to discover whether a little girl once taught to name pine cones had spent her entire life unaware that someone had never stopped waiting to welcome her home. Over the following week, Daniel Carter discovered that small mountain towns carried memories the way old forests carried rings beneath their bark. Conversations at Silver Ridge diners, church offices, and the county records building gradually transformed scattered fragments into a path leading towards someone who had unknowingly spent decades separated from a love preserved on paper. Hannah Cooper was no longer the little girl from the photographs tucked behind the fireplace. She had built an entire life several states away, working as an elementary school librarian in Oregon, known by neighbors as kind, thoughtful, and quietly devoted to the children who wandered among shelves searching for stories that helped them understand themselves. Daniel sat at his kitchen table beneath the warm glow of the cabin lights with Shadow resting nearby as he carefully considered the telephone number written on the notepad before him. The journals, photographs, letters, marble, and greeting cards remained arranged across the table exactly as he had found them. Outside, winter had begun loosening its grip on the mountains. Icicles dripped steadily from the porch roof beneath brighter afternoon skies. He dialed the number with a steadiness he did not entirely feel. When Hannah answered, her voice carried the warmth of someone accustomed to reading stories aloud. Daniel introduced himself simply. He explained how his German Shepherd had led him to discover a hidden compartment behind an old fireplace. He spoke about photographs, journals, and letters addressed in her grandfather's careful handwriting. Silence followed. Then came the sound of someone trying very hard to breathe, evenly through unexpected tears. Hannah admitted she remembered fragments of Colorado from childhood. The scent of pine trees after snowfall. A marble she had once treasured but believed she had lost. Her grandfather teaching her that every constellation looked different depending upon where a person stood beneath the sky. Life had moved quickly after her family relocated. Adults carried burdens children rarely understood. Time stretched. Addresses changed. Pride and grief often disguised themselves as permanence until years became decades. 2 weeks later, Hannah stood inside the cabin where her earliest memories had first taken root. Sunlight filtered through the windows while late winter winds stirred gently beyond the pines. She moved slowly through each room, fingertips brushing worn wooden surfaces as if greeting old friends whose names she had nearly forgotten. When Daniel placed the marble-marked H.C. into her hands, she stared at it in stunned silence before laughing softly through tears. "I searched everywhere for this," she whispered. Shadow approached carefully and rested his head against her knee. Hannah knelt beside the German Shepherd, gratitude shining openly across her face. Together they sat beside the fireplace as Daniel handed her Thomas Cooper's journals one by one. She read passages aloud describing snowball fights, birthday wishes, and afternoons spent naming pine cones beneath towering evergreens. With every page, absence surrendered ground to belonging. Evenings settled gently across the valley as flames danced once more inside the restored hearth. Hannah looked toward Daniel with eyes reflecting both sorrow and peace. "Thank you for staying long enough to listen," she said softly. Daniel glanced down at Shadow resting comfortably beside the fire and understood how profoundly his own life had shifted through a mystery he had never sought. He had purchased the cabin believing solitude offered safety. Instead, an old fireplace, a loyal German Shepherd, and a forgotten marble had reminded him that healing often arrives disguised as responsibility toward another person's unfinished story. Outside, snowmelt traced quiet paths down the mountainsides while stars emerged above the Colorado sky exactly as they had decades before. Inside, laughter returned to rooms that had waited patiently to hear it again. Shadow sighed contentedly beside the hearth, amber eyes half closed in the firelight. Daniel realized that the greatest inheritance hidden within the cabin had never been wealth, secrets, or long-lost possessions. It had been the chance to carry love the final distance home, because sometimes miracles are simply ordinary people choosing not to walk away from what still matters, and perhaps the world remembers kindness longer than we think.